Remembrance of things past is not necessarily the remembrance of things as they were. I'm pretty sure you didn't have Proust cited over the Ninja Turtles on your GDC bingo card, right? So hello everyone, my name is Frédéric Gémus. I've been working in the video game industry for over 15 years now. I started my career at Ubisoft Montreal, which explained the beautiful French-Canadian accent you're hearing, and worked on big AAA franchises over there, such as Far Cry, Rainbow Six Siege, and Assassin's Creed. But 3 years ago, I decided to leave the AAA market and join Tribute Games, a studio dedicated to making retro gaming inspired titles with a modern twist. That might sound like a weird jump to some of you, but in the Montreal retro gaming community, I'm more known for the video game store I co-own, Retro MTL, a store dedicated to video games from every generations, and the gaming podcast I co-host, Retro Nouveau, a French podcast about modern and retro gaming. I'm also a collector myself with over 3,000 unique titles in my collection, which takes a lot of shelf space. So it is fair to say that I was pretty much meant to join my friends at Tribute Games, who are also share that same passion for retro gaming. Founded in 2011 by Jonathan Lavigne and Jean-François Major, Tribute Games developed many titles mixing both retro-inspired gameplays and modern features, such as Mercenary Kings, Flint Hook, and Panzer Paladin. This love for modern interpretations of older generations of gaming definitively became relevant when both worked on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the video game, another pixelated beat-em-up title they worked on at Ubisoft before leaving and decided to go found their own studio. Having also worked on other beat-em-up games at Ubisoft, including at TMNT Games, Tribute's founders always wanted to have a shot at making another Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game inspired by the arcade. And after discussions with Nickelodeon and a partnership with the amazing publisher Dotemu, or Dotemu, like people say here, the project became a reality. And just as the year 2020 started, we also launched work on TMNT Shredder's Revenge, a 6-player drop-in, drop-out beat-em-up multiplayer game with 16 stages for around 3 hours of gameplay. It is also important to note that the title would have no direct relation to Konami's previous title, but act more as a spiritual sequel. So this is finally happening. We're finally making our dream TMNT game. So, where do we start? Looking at the legacy of the previous titles is probably the obvious starting point. Fondly remembered for their exciting multiplayer gameplay, their polished visuals, and for containing all content from the show, the arcade games are probably some of the most memorable gaming memories for anyone hanging out in the arcades at the beginning of the 90s. Home console ports were also very popular, if not even more, but captured the arcade's magic in its own way, with all of the limitations of each systems at the time. Still, after 2 successful arcade titles and a few home console versions and spin-offs, the TMNT games disappeared for a while. And ever since they came back, many TMNT games that were released were actually met with comparison to the beloved arcade iterations. So how can we succeed then? First, by understanding the core of the original games and what made them such timeless classics. You need to dive deeper than what the player remember, but use your knowledge of game design to understand why they were good games in the first place. Second, you need to carefully choose which features are part of that core and which ones can be left behind. You don't want to redo the originals. You want to adapt them to modern gaming standards. And finally, in order to keep the experience fresh and relevant as a new take on the franchise, you need to determine the right new features to add in order to make that core experience even stronger without compromising it. Basically, this comes down to a saying that Jean-François, our founder, always says: make sure the game plays like how you would remember it, not how it was. Or, put simply, plays like you remember. So what do people actually remember about the previous games? So before I go further, I just want to mention that the excellent Cowabunga collection, compiling all of the TMNT games from the 90s era, came out after the release of Shredder's Revenge. So at the time, These games were indeed memories for a lot of players out there. So let's just ignore that for now. So one of the strongest memories is, of course, the four players multiplayer experience, all crammed around the cabinet. Then the visuals, which were closer to the cartoon than any other video game at the time. Plus, it featured all characters from the beloved show. The game also had non-stop action and some exciting stage setups with skateboard push-ups and even like time travel. But more importantly, it felt like an authentic TMNT experience on par with the show. What's actually less remembered is how the games were, classic coin-op arcade games, built in a way to get as many quarters as it can from you. It also featured limited range of abilities and some repetitions, especially when you're playing in free play. This also highlights the breakneck pace of some of the encounters, where players can get swarmed by enemies for a minute and then the minute after just be left waiting for enemies to come back on screen. And of course, even more present in the home console ports, where all of the technical aspects like sprite flickering, slowdowns, and all technical limitations that were there back in the days. So hey, that's easy then. You just take what the players remember from the older titles, and you simply avoid doing the bad things they forgot. Plus, the technical aspect should be covered pretty much by itself. But actually, the correct answer is you indeed need to take time, to analyze what players remember and take it as part of the ingredients for your game. But you also need to take time to analyze the core gameplay of what you're trying to adapt and find what were the strong elements that actually kept the players around for long enough. Basically, this is the recipe for the adaptation of your game. Remember that intro about our love for older games? Well, here's the thing. We still enjoy these games today and play them regularly after all of these years. So we got better at understanding them. And so can you. With our modern understanding of game design, it is a great exercise to actually take time to revisit old games to understand what made those games click. In the case of TMNT, we always felt that even though the arcade games were impressive, the console ports, especially the Nintendo NES version, provided a clearer picture of what made the game great. First, the common aspect both the NES and the arcade version have is the enemy design. Enemies are made to be dealt with quickly, as soon as they enter the screen. The gameplay focuses on crowd control and how fast you can dispose of these enemies as they enter the arena in order to avoid getting swarmed rather than focusing on the fighting aspect or the one-on-one combat. With the technical limitations of consoles and the gameplay experience meant for longer play sessions, you can also see that the enemies are more aggressive and spawn while performing actions, mostly attacks, resulting in more pressure on the player, which kind of replicates the swarming feelings that the player can get on the arcade. This also induced a better pacing for combats, as less enemies on screen means how their entry in the arena and how the encounter unravels does create the real challenge. It also provides a better control of the game balancing, as there is obviously no need to get rid of the player after 5 minutes, therefore giving some breathing time to the players and more opportunities for designers to come up with different types of challenges. In the case of TMNT, the arcade game on the NES, Jonathan, our game director, always brought up how well the game was balanced so that you can usually manage to get to Shredder at the end, but hardly beat him. Our key discoveries from those sessions were that the pacing of these games were actually an important part of their core experience. The way enemies spawn and the speed at which they are disposed is also completely tied to how the combat encounters are structured and what makes the gameplay exciting. We noticed that combat encounters almost felt like classic shoot-'em-up games, such as Gradius or Hard-Type, where the spawning choreography directly impacts the player's positioning and actions. And finally, all of this should result in a fair challenge that feels achievable. All of these elements directly influence the player's experience, even though they are not as commonly mentioned while talking about the classics. And that is the actual recipe for the game. A simple to jump in beat 'em up games that feel fair, that feels fair, sorry, where enemies are quick to defeat and in which the way enemies enter the fight is more important than how they actually fight. It has to be built with multiplayer at its core, and of course, being authentic to the TMNT 1987 universe with all of its silliness and colorful characters. Our analysis actually helped us identify aspects the players talk less about, the enemy behaviors, which is actually more important than to the core experience than most of the points since it greatly affects the core gameplay. And at the end of the day, if you look at these guidelines, it's pretty much our game in broad lines. And now that we have the actual recipe for the game, it's time to mix all of the features together in order to create the perfect adaptation. At the core, we knew the gameplay had to be easy to pick up, yet deep enough to be engaging on the long run. We built it with the same two button basis as the arcade games, a jump and an attack button, which can basically let anyone get involved in the game quickly. We decided to separate special attacks to their own buttons in order to avoid players' mistakes while button mashing, and added an extra dodge button for more advanced combat strategies. All of these actions can be combined either successively or simultaneously for different outcomes that are clear to the players as they explore the controls. Also inspired by the arcade games, each characters are meant to be played the same way with the same input combinations, but we added different outcomes and particularities for each. For example, Michelangelo can bounce on enemies after a dive kick, or Raphael will do a suplex instead of a standard throw. This was meant for replayability as players can get to know each characters, but also as a way to be more multiplayer friendly, since if your favorite character gets picked up, you won't be forced to learn how to play a completely different character. At one point, we did push that philosophy a bit too far though. We had longer recovery time to some character moves, different cancel windows, and other various game feel tweaks based on characters, which turned out to be too complex and cumbersome. We decided to remove most of these in order to keep the game feel more fluid and permissive and less, feeling like an actual turtle. And finally, we wanted to counter some of the more common beat-em-up flaws by locking the enemies on screen, making the edges of the camera act as collisions. So this prevented the expulsion of enemies from the screen, which would resolve into downtime for the players as they have to wait for them to come back on screen. But it also introduced the notion of juggling, a fun side effect. We also worked hard on having soft targeting of enemies on the depth axis, so players wouldn't spend too much time missing enemies while attacking, as it is often the case in some old school beat 'em ups. When it came to building the levels, the pacing discoveries we did in our research phase were very helpful for setting up the level design guidelines. We knew we needed to have strong pacing, where each encounter is either structured by a succession of enemies, a calculated flow of enemies that the players must manage, or a constant flow that can get players overwhelmed if they don't react too quickly. We looked at the NES game for the enemy per minute ratio, which was around 20 to 30 enemies per minute, as we felt it not only had one of the best balancing, but also the clearer single-player experience. It also provided the clearer enemy choreography, which we ended up calling the dance, or a golden path if you prefer. We decided to build each stage with a golden path in mind, where if the player positioned himself correctly and performed the right action at the right time, he can basically complete each stages to perfection. By having a dance plan for each stages, we were able to basically do a first paper pass of each stage's design and notice where situations might get too similar or too uncomfortable. But it didn't help us beat the beat 'em up grudge, or the repetition that comes from, the duration of stages. Our first stage iterations lasted above the 15-minute mark, making the stage feels way too long and tedious. We almost had to cut, half of the first stage we built in order to keep the gameplay engaging. At the end of the day, we noticed that making stages last for under 10 minutes, including the boss encounter, was the sweet spot for keeping the gameplay engaging and fresh. AI and combat behavior were obviously another big point to work on, as previous games mostly had simpler enemy AI, where spawn enemies will mostly try to reach the player and launch an attack as soon as they can. It is quite effective, but it doesn't always feel exciting, or it might end up feeling a bit more predictable. We decided to make them a bit more complex by first introducing the notion of combat circle, a notion that might be familiar to some of you who worked on enemy designs, where enemies could not only position themselves relatively to the player based on their current status, but mostly avoid cluttering the player, which could lead to actually making the combat easier since most of our attacks have quite some reach. This combat circle logic was also very useful for managing how enemies switch focus in multiplayer, making sure all players were always involved in combat. And finally, in order to control the challenge, we decided to base ourselves on an attack token logic, inspired by a previous GDC talk from Kurt Lowdy and Jake Campbell called Embracing Push Forward Combat in Doom. With this logic, enemies must request a token in order to perform an attack or a combo, meaning that you can control the number of enemies that can attack simultaneously, but also add a cooldown to these tokens, making the enemies more or less aggressive as a group. This is especially useful when you're trying to create different difficulty settings. But these prove to be more or less efficient with our low HP enemies, since some of them tried to reach specific positions in order to do an action, or simply had to wait for a token in the middle of a breakneck fight. It became clear that we needed to not only reduce the cooldowns on attacks and increase the amount of tokens at play in order to reach an interesting fight in both scenarios with few or large group of enemies, but we needed enemies to act faster at large. This basically brought us, once again to one of our key discoveries that we didn't follow too closely. The enemy entrance is the gameplay. By introducing more active spawning strategies, we managed to resolve most of our inactive and slow to react AI and provide a way more exciting combat. And finally, we had the core gameplay pretty much nailed down. And as you can see, all of the features are coming along together pretty well for the recipe, but we're still missing a very important ingredient: the multiplayer. Now it was time to put everything together for the best couch co-op experience possible. But we're now in the middle of a global pandemic, and we're all working from home. The pandemic obviously impacted all of us in terms of how we approach game development, but in this case, it kind of forced us to do quite a positive compromise. Focus on the online first. Making a local co-op experience isn't as risky as making it online, with all of the replication issues, lag, and everything that the players like to label as netcode, So for a small team like ours, it forced us to make sure that every feature's first iterations was always multiplayer ready. This meant a lot more development time to invest in each first iterations, but also a more stable overall experience as we went along. As for replication, we knew the nature of the game would make it very hard to perfectly replicate everything that is happening on screen for each player, so we decided to focus on each player's experience. If you're attacking an enemy, this enemy will be replicated perfectly on your machine, but might be a bit off on the other players' sides. Players' focus dictated the priorities of replications, and at the end of the day, even though you might spot inaccuracies, each player's gameplay experience is always solid and enjoyable, especially with 6 players creating pure chaos on screen. Now that we had all of the features from the core gameplay well adapted, it was time to, add our own touch to the mix with new ingredients to try. The obvious choice of action when approaching, older titles is to change some of the more restrictive rules. One key aspect from most classic beat-em-up games is the fact that special attacks will cost health points to use them, creating a very high risk versus reward scenario that, according to us, doesn't really work in TMNT's case. In fact, some of the TMNT games themselves do not abide to this rule at all. Using these special moves to get out of trouble in a game with tons of enemies might happen too often for a game with a cost on these actions, as it would force us to greatly increase the amount of health recovery in, items and stages, therefore removing some sense of risk in the overall gameplay. Yet, removing any risk or cost to these would be as problematic for the gameplay as it would make them the only viable strategy. We decided in the end to link them to a new combo system, which fills a special power bar that can be consumed by the player to do these actions. The idea, seen in fighting game, became clear to us while replaying the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, where if you reach a certain amount of tricks in a row or combo, you gain access to moves that are more valuable. This concept worked well with our game, with our core gameplay as keeping the player engaged in combat at all time and dealing with enemies as soon as they spawn means that they would get rewarded with even more powerful tools to do that. But in order to keep things accessible for less experienced players, we also allowed players to use a taunt action to refill that same bar. We felt that it was a good compromise for players risking themselves into a taunt animation to be able to stock on these moves, and felt that if a player wanted to abuse them, it would only mean that they were willingly sacrificing the quality of their experience. However, what we didn't plan ahead is that this would end up ruining the experience of some online players, as every combat sequences would end. Some players would spam the taunt button multiple times in a row in order to fully refill their special moves, meaning that some players might end up waiting for almost 10 seconds before progressing to the next challenge. This led us to a fix in one of our title updates, preventing players to spam it for more than one time, therefore keeping a middle ground between giving it tools to players in need and avoiding abuse. And for the players who wanted this completely removed, we also added an extra custom game mode as a free title update in which players could completely turn it off. Another thing we wanted to focus on is making a game that can actually scale and adapt itself for multiplayer. The AI and enemy logic, already tackled with the combat circles, worked well with this, but we also wanted the gameplay to adapt. We decided to have an adaptive level design, which could change based on the number of players at play. We didn't want it to do so with an automated system that would simply add more enemies, as this would mean even more things on screen. But decided to do it by hand. So this way we could do things such as replacing two enemies by one stronger enemy, or simply changing the layout configuration to something that felt more interesting. At the end of the day, we build these encounters trying to keep every player busy at all time, forcing them to scatter or regroup based on the enemy's actions. This obviously meant we had to redo each stages multiple times, so we settled with only 3 configurations. One for single player, another for 2 to 3 players, and one for more than 4 players. We went with these as we noted that as soon as we go over 4 players, things on screen become pure chaos. The game remains fun, but the action becomes very hard to read and the whole gameplay becomes more of a button-mashing party game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing considering that you're probably playing with 5 other friends. We also wanted to add co-op attacks that would not require complex synchronizations, but could occur by accident. So, for example, if 2 players attack an enemy from both sides, they would do a sandwich attack instead of doing their regular attack. These worked well in local multiplayer and created great water cooler moments when triggered, but ended up being a nightmare to handle with the online lag, forcing us to reduce their occurrence with strict rules in order to avoid creating weird situations where players would trigger them without understanding why, due to latency. And finally, we also introduced a notion of revives, where players can get revived by their teammates when knocked down, creating an interesting dynamic between combat and teamwork as, it forces players to quickly switch focus in the middle of tense scenarios, But of course, one of the recurrent memories from playing the older games in multiplayer was stealing the pizza power up, which rewards you with HP from another player in need. We decided to introduce the notion of party pizzas, a simple fix which heals everyone on pickup. But we still added some single player, pizzas through each stages in order to keep that couch drama that makes the local multiplayer so fun. While focusing on doing a multiplayer game, we also wanted to offer something for single player. We decided to do so by providing two game modes, a story mode and an arcade mode. Arcade mode was built on classic arcade rules, where you need to beat the game with a limited amount of credits, but story mode is there to provide players with a longer experience with both safe progression and character upgrades. This quickly brought up the question of having side missions, which is something that didn't necessarily match our gameplay at first, since it's not only, since not only the core gameplay is fast-paced and engaging, but the whole narrative around the game revolves around the chase. We decided to up most of these on collecting items hidden through each stages, which not only avoided, for us to create extra content that didn't fit our main stages, but also helped us give more importance to supporting characters by giving them extra interactions with the player. And as stated, we also introduced the notion of character progression, but kept those to basically extra gameplay helpers like more HP, new special attacks, and more power bars, as we wanted the players to be able to tackle each challenges, whether they were level 1 or level 10. Where we might have missed the mark, though, was on the naming convention for the story mode. Since both modes were fully supporting multiplayer, we didn't want it to have any single player mode and decided to go with story mode, a designation often used in gaming. In hindsight, the story mode was probably not the right name, since most players felt that they would get extra cutscenes or such, and probably should have been called more like a campaign or something like that to avoid the confusion. And finally, the big thing we absolutely wanted to do was making sure that the game would be enjoyed by everyone. At Tribute Games, we always strive to make that game, which can introduce younger generations to retro gaming, and with Shredder's Revenge, it felt like we hit that mark better than ever with all of the accessibility changes we did. We received messages from parents telling us that they were able to introduce their kids to the game, casual gamers that wanted to give it a try in order to relive the older arcade days had a blast, fans of the shows and fans of the old games enjoyed it, basically everyone. Except, of course, a few people, mostly from the more hardcore beat 'em up audiences. Most of these complaints revolved around, the difficulty level of the game or the respect of some old tropes from the beat 'em up genre. For example, like being invincible while performing throws or not consuming any HP from, HP while performing special attacks. At the end of the day, pleasing these audiences would mean compromising the things that newcomers and less experienced player likes. This is why we decided to provide an extra game mode for free in post-launch, where players can basically tweak the rules of the arcade mode, similar to dip switches, from older arcade cabinets, meaning that casual players could actually make the game easier by enabling options such as free play, but hardcore players could make the game even harder with more aggressive enemies, classic HP consuming special moves, or removing any taunt bonuses. This also helped give a second win to the game just in time for the holidays, where, even more players of all type could enjoy the game. So at the end of the day, did we actually succeed at making a worthy spiritual successor to the older TMNT arcade games? On June 16, 2022, on pretty much all consoles, the game was finally out. We ended up with Metacritic scores between 84 to 87%, depending on the console, with very positive feedback from the community. In terms of sales figure, we sold over 1 million copies in the first week alone, a massive success for both Tribute Games and Dotemu, but also for Nickelodeon. Our partnership with Xbox and Game Pass also keeps, bringing new players to this day, and so does the in-store physical copies. And we also ended 2022 with multiple awards and nominations, beautifully turning the page on quite a successful year. This success can be attributed to the amazing work from the whole team at Tribute Games, which was always committed to delivering the best experience possible, and the incredible support and dedication from Dodimu, but also to our philosophy to make the game plays just like you remember. And with a strong analysis of what you're trying to adapt, by adapting features instead of reproducing them, and by carefully adding your own touch to the mix, you too can succeed at reviving any beloved franchise to the modern gaming scene. Thank you.